Things you love when you're an ENTP. I decided to wear my ENTP hair in honor of this video. Playing to the crowd. God is a comedian. Playing to an audience too afraid to laugh. Perhaps this is the most controversial point, and by controversial I mean inaccurate. I noticed that ENTPs have a performative nature to them that manifests in some form. The reason why many ENTPs might not resonate with this is because they can often feel pretty introverted in the social sense. They won't necessarily see themselves as very outgoing or in your face when it comes to people. They aren't going out of their way to barge into the spotlight. However, I have noticed this trend with ENTPs that at some point down the line, they desire and require an audience. This can occur in many forms, such as products they make, but I'd say the most common medium of performance is simply in conversation. Things like humor and wit are inextricably linked to having a recipient. They need that reaction, either from a crowd or just one person. Saying they need an audience or desire one is simply the same thing as saying they need people in some form. Some ENTPs can find themselves really needing people, but not necessarily liking them. If you prod and poke a person, both literally and verbally, you'll get a reaction. That interactivity is something they enjoy, especially when it's real time. Also, their extroverted feeling is something they like to satisfy and just make use of. ENTPs are excellent at reading a room and assessing the vibe of a situation. The reason this is often obscured and masked is because their ability to accurately deduce the mood doesn't mean they will fit in with it. In fact, they like to pull the rug from under you. They like to confound expectations. In order to be subversive, you need to have a strong grip on what it is you're actually subverting. They can lead you towards a punchline, only for a joke to take a left turn and hit an unexpected beat. I would even say that this could be one of the biggest indicators between mature and immature ENTPs. Mature ENTPs are subversive, whereas immature ENTPs are just offensive. Sometimes they'll want to make some kind of ethical, political, or philosophical statement, or imbue a sense of social commentary into what they're saying. There'll be an underlying message to a joke, one that might not be obvious at first. However, one important thing to bear in mind, unlike with some types where a joke is always making a point, with ENTPs, sometimes the joke itself is the point. Hence why their approach to life can often be seen as absurdist. There is nothing underneath that layer. It's absurdity all the way down. It's often said of certain great actors that they have an intuitive sense of where the camera is at all times, and therefore how they're being seen. I think ENTPs have something strangely similar. Maybe it's more an intuitive sense of where the fourth wall exists. Contrarianism and proving people wrong. I swim against the tide because I like to annoy. This plays into the stereotype of them being debate lords and devil's advocates. The best way that I can explain this tendency is that it's natural and easy for them in a kind of reflexive way. Because of their particular cognitive makeup, it's easy for them to see contradictions and exceptions to the rule. If someone comes out with some sweeping statement, it'll be easy for them to tell where that generalization falls apart. So this is not necessarily a deep trait of theirs. It's simply that it's the lowest hanging fruit they can reach for. That's not necessarily to diminish it, but just to point out that it's easy for them. It's also very much related to the desire to prove people wrong. ENTPs are typically enthusiastic and energetic people, but committing to one course of action for a long time can feel like a drag. Probably the most intense and lasting motivation for them is the one ignited by someone saying, "That's not possible," or even better, that you won't be able to do that. Whereas one side of the spectrum might be gotcha moments in debates, which can sometimes have a negative connotation or perhaps not be done in good faith, there is a flip side to this. That other end of the spectrum is inspiring people. A couple of other types have this reputation, but I think that ENTPs deserve it equally, if not more. When you combine these traits of wanting an audience, someone to perform to, whilst also wanting to point out contradictions, prove people wrong, see the exceptions to the rule, the way around something, the angle that a person hasn't considered yet, they love to show people what is possible. And that is a large part of what being inspirational is. As ENTPs will no doubt know, showing people what is possible doesn't always go down well. People are comfortable with the familiar and will stick to a way that has worked for them in the past, even when there is a much better way. As a result of this, I think that ENTPs can often come across as much more combative and aggressive even than they actually are. If you're not an ENTP and you're watching this, firstly, thanks. Secondly, if an ENTP in your life suggests something to you, I would highly recommend always starting with, "That's a great idea." If you dismiss it or don't acknowledge it, you might find yourself being hammered with it until you have to take it seriously. Paradoxes and irony. As for the ironic, I shan't attempt a definition here. It's the gin in the Campari, the X factor, the knight's move on the chessboard, the cat's purr, the knot in the carpet. I'll make this point briefly because I have referenced it in quite a few other videos. Since ENTPs are somewhat wired to see endless possibilities, settling down on one, even when it's a good one, can be disappointing. Of course, they are still very much a type that wants to figure out answers and truth, but there is always going to be a certain beauty in uncertainty. Things like paradoxes offer the prospect of keeping both opposing options open at the same time. It's like having your philosophical cake and eating it too. Even if the ideas might be seemingly irreconcilable, they can still coexist, and it still works. In some ways, I think that irony has a similar kind of appeal to them. The fact that there is this way that some things ought to be, then the universe, in an almost conspiratorial fashion, takes a person's story and flips it, or inverts it. I think that life's capacity to offer up those curveballs allows them to keep faith that things always have the promise of being interesting. If you're an ENTP, I don't think you're going to like and subscribe, or join our Discord server. Prove me wrong.